And greetings to you. Joe Rubenstein here, producer and host of Real-Time 1960s. I want to thank you very much for joining me today and to remind you that you can find all of our content on our website, realtime1960s.com. You can find us on Facebook as well, and if you love what we're doing, visit patreon.com/realtime1960s, support this project, get exclusive access to bonus content, and help us continue to bring you this ongoing portal into the past. That's patreon.com/realtime1960s. And today, we resume our journey up my ranked list of the top 10 films of 1965. Last time, we covered film number 10, The Sons of Katie Elder, and today, we move on to film number 9. So without further ado, my 9th ranked film for 1965, right now. And number 9 on my list is a French New Wave feature by Jean-Luc Godard, his second release of 65 and 10th, in the space of just 6 years, Pierrot Le Fou, or Pierrot the Madman. Filmed in June and July of 65, it premiered at the Venice Film Festival in August of that year, very quick turnaround, and it's a film that really couldn't differ more from my 10th ranked film, a John Wayne Western, with two exceptions. Both films are uneven, today's even more so, and both films are substantially enhanced by their photographers and composers. In this case, Raoul Coutard, who shot much of Pierrot outdoors on the French Riviera in color, and Antoine Duhamel, whose unsettling orchestral score for Pierrot recalls some of Bernard Herrmann's work for Hitchcock. The title role is played by Jean-Paul Belmondo, although actually the character's name is not Pierrot, it's Ferdinand. But his partner in crime, Marianne, played by Godard's soon-to-be ex-wife Anna Karina, a mysterious babysitter with whom Belmondo escapes his family and conventional life in Paris, she insists on calling him Pierrot, with Belmondo patiently correcting her every time, which gets old pretty fast. But Pierrot was kind of a stock figure, a tragic clown in early European theater, the Commedia dell'arte, and Marianne, a quasi-femme fatale, foresees Ferdinand's ultimate heartbreak and disillusionment, even if he does not, and so calls him Pierrot. Karina, by the way, would appear in her 7th and final Godard feature 1 year after this one, after their divorce, called Made in USA, which is absolutely one of the worst films I've ever seen all the way through. And Godard made 2 or 3 others that I would rank among the worst films I did not manage to make it through. So, for reasons I hope to clarify, I'm not exactly an uncritical admirer of this director's work, although I do admire certain aspects of it. The truth is, even Godard's best films from this, his most important period, the New Wave period, which began in 1960 and ended in 68, have major flaws. But it's also true that his films require a somewhat different critical approach, as he didn't really make films at all, in the conventional sense of the word. As he once said, "I don't make films, I make cinema." Which sounds pretentious, but there is a point there, which is, he never had any real interest in telling a story, and in fact, he constantly undermines whatever narrative there is with various digressions and distancing devices, which underscore the fact that the film you're watching, and all films by extension, are fabrications. For example, in today's film, as Belmondo and Karina are driving their getaway car, Belmondo is thinking out loud, and suddenly Karina interrupts him and asks, "Who are you talking to?" And he gestures at the back seat at us, where the cameraman was sitting, and says, "The audience." And then Karina casually looks directly out at us and says, "Oh yeah," and then they go on with their conversation. So suspension of disbelief never happens in Godard's films. They are not carefully constructed narratives that seek to draw the viewer in, but deconstructed assemblages of segments and fragments that are draped onto some skeleton plot or concept which serves as a basic frame or pretext for this assemblage. Now, another Godardian distancing device is the demarcation of a given film's segments with full-screen titles. One of his better early films, for example, My Life to Live, is subtitled A Film in 12 Scenes, each of which is preceded by a title card listing the events about to transpire, similar to chapter headings in some 19th century novels, by Dickens, for example. And then Masculine Feminine, released between Pierrot and Made in USA, is subtitled 15 Precise Facts, and also features full-screen titles. So, as a kind of homage, I thought I'd subdivide today's review in similar fashion. So, here are 5 somewhat precise observations on Pierrot Le Fou and Godard's New Wave period in general. Observation 1. Godard's New Wave films are similar in one respect to the music and evolving personal style of the Beatles, as they serve in part as a chronicle of the 60s. Born in 1930, Godard, who, like François Truffaut, began his career as a critic, was about 10 years older than the Beatles, but his New Wave period evolved in parallel to their career and thus to the passage of the 60s. And also like the Beatles, Godard was very prolific, producing 15 features and 8 shorts between 60 and 68, and was thus able to keep up with the increasingly frantic rate of change in the 60s. Now, what also helps them serve as a chronicle is, from the beginning, Godard incorporated references to contemporary events, relevant or not, that were happening at the time of filming. As he once said, everything should be in a film. So his first feature, Breathless, filmed in September of '59, incorporates Eisenhower's visit to Paris that month. His second, Le Petit Soldat, shot in '60 but banned by the French government, deals with the French war in Algeria. The ban was lifted, by the way, when that war ended in '63. A Married Woman, released in '64, references the thalidomide scandal and the Auschwitz trials happening at that time in Frankfurt. Masculine Feminine, filmed in November and December of '65, refers to the closely contested presidential election in France happening during filming, with Charles de Gaulle winning a runoff against his left-wing challenger François Mitterrand. And today's film includes 3 sequences dealing with Vietnam, the first major film, to my knowledge, to even mention that war, the American rendition, that is. The French war in Vietnam in the 50s had been covered, but 1965 was the year of the big push by the U.S. On January 1st of that year, there were about 23,000 U.S. advisors in Vietnam, but a year later there were nearly 200,000 military personnel, including ground troops, and that number would increase to over 500,000 by the end of '67. But according to Susan Sontag, who published 2 very interesting essays on Godard in the 60s, he announced around the time of Pierrot that he would insert references to Vietnam into all of his films until the war ended, which I think he lived up to. But there are other topical references as well. At one point, Belmondo mentioned Soviet astronaut Alexei Leonov and American astronaut Ed White, both of whom conducted the first spacewalks that spring. There's also a reference to a civil war raging in Yemen at that time, about which I knew nothing. So, for those interested in history as it unfolds, as I am, obviously, Godard's films, while they don't explore these events in great depth, they do have this kind of exciting, hot-off-the-presses feel. And again, since he released so many so fast, he never really got left behind. In fact, by '67, the apex of the hippie movement, he was ahead of the curve. His 3 films released that year, especially the latter 2, La Chinoise and Weekend, deal not with flower power and good vibrations, but with violence and extremism, and so serve as kind of sneak previews for 1968. Observation number 2. There are topical touchstones which pop up again and again in Godard's films of this period, including the following: prostitution, both literally and as a metaphor for capitalism, satirical blasts at consumerism, resentment toward the U.S. and its position of cultural and political dominance, a deconstructionist approach to language and words, violence, often in the form of car crashes, We see the bloody aftermath of one in today's film, but also shootings, stabbings, bombings, torture, and by the time of Weekend, released at the end of '67, cannibalism and the actual on-screen slaughter of a pig. And while the violence, with the exception of the pig slaughter, is depicted unrealistically, it is presented with a kind of ironic, cool detachment, which is disturbing. And then one final touchstone would be increasingly far-left politics, which culminated with Godard going all-out Marxist in 1968, at which point his New Wave period ends, and his films become dreary, kind of half-coherent ideological discourses shot through with his own personal affectations. But most of these New Wave touchstones, with the exception of prostitution, show up in today's film. Consumerism is lampooned in one of the better early sequences in the film. Just before Belmondo runs off with Karina, his wife drags him to a party in hopes of finding him a job. And at that party, the guests don't converse. They take turns reciting texts of advertisements for clothing, cars, etc., as a disgusted Belmondo blows cigarette smoke in their faces. Godard uses colored filters in that sequence to punch it up visually, very effective. As for violence, in addition to the car crash, Belmondo is tortured by OAS terrorists. The OAS was a right-wing paramilitary/terrorist organization during the French-Algerian War. And there are also shootings, a neck stabbing, and the explosive final scene, which I won't reveal. The deconstructionist wordplay includes tight close-ups of advertisements, so we see words within words, a favorite Godardian device. And then there's periodic voiceover by Belmondo and Karina, where they alternate disembodied bits of phrases. This wordplay, by the way, is to me the most boring and pretentious weapon in Godard's creative arsenal, and unfortunately it becomes more and more prevalent with each successive film. Observation number 3. Godard was arguably the most unconventional, iconoclastic major filmmaker of the 60s, really from the beginning, with the shocking at the time jump cuts and non-matching shots in Breathless, and then just pushing the envelope further and further with every film. But to me, his most interesting innovation was the absorption of virtually every form of filmmaking into his cinematic output. So his films, especially the later ones, really don't belong to any genre. They're just Godard films. Now, the early ones you could divide into two rough categories. First, the urban-centered ones, which have a kind of cockeyed B-movie film noir feel. I'd put Breathless in that category, also Band of Outsiders. And then the other early category would be the ones influenced by Antonioni, the best of which is Contempt from 1963, in which Godard worked with two very good actors, Michel Piccoli and Brigitte Bardot. Another in that category would be A Married Woman, which Antonioni himself praised after seeing it at the Venice Film Festival in 1964. But starting with My Life to Live, we start to see documentary or documentary-style insertions into fictional material, which is very interesting. In that film, for example, amidst the story of the downfall of a fictional prostitute, there's a voiceover segment dealing with the external facts of prostitution in post-war Paris, the process, laws, finances, etc. And there's also a scene where the prostitute, played by Karina, probably her best performance, has a conversation in a cafe with an actual philosopher, Brice Perrin, who speaks his own spontaneous words. So to me, this omnivorous cinematic approach of Godard's, especially the mixing of documentary and fictional material, is the freshest and most exciting aspect of his work. Observation 4. Godard often worked without a script, making things up as he went along, which had two negative results. One, it was tough on his actors, as they could not prepare, which of course affected their performances. And two, many segments in his films, in my opinion, come off as shallow in conception and sloppy in execution, which is why I'm not a fan of improvisational art. I mean, a jazz trumpeter blowing a solo is one thing, but composers, novelists, filmmakers, anyone responsible for creating a structure really needs to do some planning. Now, on the positive side, this spontaneous approach does occasionally result in fresh, brilliant sequences. But here's a partial catalog of the good and the bad to be found in Pierrot. Let's start with the bad. Sequences that had my fast-forwarding finger itch like crazy include 2 music hall-type songs performed by Karina, not a great singer. Also, the various references to the Algerian War and the OAS add nothing but confusion. And then finally, a pair of very tedious cameo sequences, one with an actual exiled Lebanese princess wearing grotesque amounts of makeup, and another with a deeply unfunny French comedian named Raymond DeVos. These segments, too, drag and add nothing to the film. Better sequences include the aforementioned party, which includes a cameo by American director Samuel Fuller. And then, this is a shot, not a sequence, but the burning of the getaway car with a long, quiet panning shot as black smoke billows across a massive field. This is quite beautiful and also serves as a haunting portent of doom. The Vietnam sequences, although just as irrelevant as the Algerian references, are better because, well, first of all, they comment on a developing situation, and second, Godard seems to have planned the Vietnam sequences more carefully, or at least had a better brainstorm that day over his morning coffee. And the final segment, which begins with Belmondo painting his face bright blue. Pierrot, like all of Godard's color films, abounds in super bright pop art colors, a sequence that continues into the explosive climax, which is followed by gentle voiceover by Belmondo and Karina over a gorgeous shot of ocean and sky. This final sequence also works very well. So with Godard, you take the good with the bad. And again, if I'm being honest, there's more bad than good. But the good is striking. And the bad sequences are made somewhat less painful in some of his other films, which include performers better than Karina. I mentioned Piccoli and Bardot in Contempt. Marina Vladi, a French-speaking Russian actress, is perfect in 2 or 3 Things I Know About Her, released in '67, probably my favorite of his. And then 2 mainstream TV actors he hired for Weekend are also perfect, especially Mireille Darc, playing an upper-middle-class wife who despises her husband, who hates her right back. They're plotting to murder each other. She ends up joining a band of whacked-out Manson-esque hippies who, after the aforementioned pig slaughter, kill and cook her husband, whom she eats. It's the last scene in the last film of his New Wave period, and it's pretty shocking, even today. It's also funny. After a few bites, which she takes as if she's sampling an hors d'oeuvre, she says in this bored tone of voice, "Not bad. I'll have more later." Okay, final observation number 5. Despite his intellectual pretensions, Godard, although very bright, was more of a cultural window shopper and name dropper than an intellectual with a coherent personal vision. He was always more of a destroyer than a creator. And in many of his films, including Pierrot, he'll just quote other artists or intellectuals in whom he was apparently interested at the time, without offering any commentary or making any effort to integrate the quoted material with his own, with the result that, to me at least, he often comes across as pretentious. Just a few examples from several of his films. Pierrot opens with Belmondo sitting in a bathtub reading out loud from a study of the Spanish painter Diego Velázquez, no relevance to the subsequent material. In A Married Woman, a housemaid describes a lovemaking session with her husband that is lifted wholesale without attribution from Celine's 1936 novel Death on the Installment Plan, again, no relevance. My Life to Live includes long clips from the 1928 Carl Dreyer film The Passion of Joan of Arc. I guess there, Godard is trying to link the doomed prostitute to Joan of Arc, which is a major stretch. To me, it just seems like an attempt at prestige by association. Masculine Feminine includes a scene, again, lifted wholesale from Dutchman, a 1964 play by Leroy Jones, later known as Amiri Baraka. Again, no credit, no relevance. and then he'll have his characters quote or refer to authors from Dante to Molière to Poe to Faulkner. Now, I suppose you could lump this quotation compulsion in with that omnivorous everything should be in a film credo I mentioned earlier. But it seems to have given Godard an undeserved reputation as an intellectual. Intellectually curious, definitely, with an almost compulsive need to challenge every norm, every convention, a tendency that probably exhausted him in the end. So it doesn't surprise me that he finally embraced Marxism with its seductively reductive vision of life. Now, given all these criticisms, you may be wondering why Pierrot Le Fou made my top 10 list at all, when, spoiler alert, far more popular, more polished films released in '65, like Dr. Zhivago or The Sound of Music, did not. The reason is that the good 20 minutes or so of Pierrot Le Fou are, to me, far more interesting than those two films combined. I did consider both, but I found each to be overlong and underwhelming, especially Zhivago. Now, an additional factor favoring Pierrot, and this may not be a fair criterion, is its topical relevance to the 60s. Zhivago, based on a 1957 novel, takes place mostly during the Russian Revolution, and The Sound of Music, a filmed version of a 1959 stage musical, takes place in 1930s Austria, or a fantasy version of 1930s Austria, which kind of offends my sense of historical reality. Back in a moment. Your feedback is important to us. On Twitter, @Realtime1960s, on our Facebook page, or you can email the program, realtime1960s@gmail.com. Really, however you'd like to engage with us, we love engaging with you. And if you'd like to join our family and help us continue to bring you great content, please go to patreon.com/realtime1960s and subscribe. Don't forget to visit us at realtime1960s.com for our timeline, each and every podcast, links to social media, how to reach us directly, everything you need to know about this portal into the past that we are creating. Thanks so much for joining us, and stay tuned for the next installment of this ongoing series covering the top 10 films of 1965. So take care, and I'll see you soon.